lovely to be with you, and Gillian and I bring a special message of love from the brothers and sisters at Shaftesbury Road in Sydney. We both have very fond memories of visits to Adelaide over a long period of time, and it's really great to be with you once again. I've got an apology to make first of all, and that is the subject for today, Jesus' Juxtapositions. I have enough trouble saying it myself, let alone what I'm doing to the poor chairman. But I actually came up with the idea of the talk, and I just couldn't get a title that I was happy with. And I said to one of my sons, I need a title for this series of talks. And he came back pretty quickly with the words Jesus' Juxtapositions. And I've always liked alliteration, so I thought that will go well. But really, just to think about juxtapositions for a moment, it's a big sounding word, but it's actually fairly simple. And it's when we put two opposing ideas together to contrast them. And what we know about Jesus is he often used a number of different methods to preach the gospel. And he very often used this technique, contrasting ideas, to focus the people he was speaking to about their spiritual journey. And we're going to look at just a few of them this weekend. But actually, when you think about it, there's really a lot of them. And I encourage you to read the Gospels with this thought in mind and just watch how often he puts these opposing things side by side. Today, we're actually going to be talking about awake or asleep. Now, there's actually a subtitle to this talk. This one is not as straightforward as some of the other juxtapositions Jesus used, but there's this idea in what Jesus said that connects the idea of being awake with watching, very closely aligned in Jesus' message, and we'll see that as we continue on. Now, our attitude to sleeping or not sleeping is really a priority indicator to us. It's a telescope for us on what we count to be important, because we put sleep off for various things and often for different things, but we all do it. Take teenager A, for example. He's at a party having a great time, and despite repeated texts from mum and dad who know he's tired and he should be asleep and tomorrow's a school day, he stays out. And he won't come home to sleep unless he hates the party. Now, things, of course, might be entirely different the next morning when it's time to get up for school. But we postpone sleep, don't we, for things that we really love in life. And some of our sons are really keen on soccer. Now, with the Women's World Cup here in Australia, the times of the matches have been quite sane and sensible. But for those of you who love soccer, you know that to watch games, often you have to get up at very strange times in the middle of the night to enjoy the sport. And I was always surprised at how readily our sons would get up at crazy hours to watch a soccer game. Not all of us love soccer, though. Some of us are into technology, and we will queue for hours for a new Apple device. And even if it's raining and cold and the weather is terrible, the things people are willing to do to be the first in line to get the latest device really tells you something about them and what they value in life. And the question we need to ask ourselves, I guess, is what will we forego for God? Will we forego sleep for him? Or only for soccer, or only for technology, or only perhaps for our friends? I knew a sister who said that she didn't attend Bible class because finishing time at 9:10 was too late. But she did manage to attend Opera House concerts, which actually finished at 11 o'clock, and even enjoyed supper after sometimes. And that's interesting, isn't it? The decisions we make. So what do you postpone sleep for? And what does that answer tell you about yourself? And more importantly, are you asleep spiritually? I'd like you to let that run around your mind as we think about the parable of the 10 bridesmaids for a little while today. let's have a look at the context first of all. Sorry, that's such a busy slide. But you can see that the Olivet prophecy is actually covered in the three records of Matthew, Mark and Luke. What's interesting is that the parable of the 10 bridesmaids is only in Matthew. But even though it's only in Matthew, the ideas that come out in this parable, the message to watch and to not sleep is very strong in all the records. You may not be able to see that, but I have highlighted the watch words, and you can see how much it's repeated. It's a real focus of this section of the Bible. If we come back to look at Matthew particularly, you can see that there's a progression in Jesus' message here that really brings out strongly this idea. It starts out with the disciples saying to Jesus, "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?" And there's various sections there in which Jesus talks about the things that we know well about the Olivet prophecy: the signs, the times, the end of the age, great tribulation, Jesus coming. He talks the parable of the fig tree. He talks about no one knowing the day on the other, and we get that strong warning to be watching and ready at any time, because it will be like a thief coming in the middle of the night. And there's the message about the faithful and evil servants there. And then the parable of the 10 virgins and the parable of the talents, and Jesus judging the nation, until finally in Matthew 26 verse 1 it says, "Now it came to pass that Jesus finished all these sayings." And the way Matthew's recorded it, he's recorded as one sequence of things, of messages that are absolutely tied together. So let's think about this parable for a moment. It's one of the intriguing ones, isn't it? Jesus gave it sitting on the Mount of Olives with his disciples, and perhaps we can imagine as the evening approached, a line of lights as a wedding procession appeared in the valley below. They had a pretty good view from there. Now, we connect with some of Jesus' parables much more than we do with others. And this one's difficult because we don't really understand the wedding traditions in Jesus' time. And it's especially challenging because when you read the experts, they differ on a lot of the customs. And if you are interested in this, there's a lot of reading you can do. Just Google it. So it's very hard for us to tell if a detail in this parable is just part of the overall story, or whether it unlocks a key spiritual message for us in 2023. I'll give you my take as we get through, and we'll try not to push it too far. But I think despite what we do with various parts of the parable, the fundamental message is crystal clear. It's about watching. And whatever we take from the other parts of the parable, we cannot miss that fundamental message that Jesus is giving. But let's just talk for a moment about some of the things that accompanied a Jewish wedding. It lasted a few days. On the evening of day one, the bridegroom with his friends formed a procession to fetch the bride from her home. And along the way, they would meet up with the bride's friends, and together they collected the bride. Everyone carried a lamp. It was an insult, apparently, to be part of the procession without your lamp burning bright. The bride was carried in a litter, beautifully dressed, and by the road people sang wedding songs. And when the procession reached the bridegroom's house, the bridegroom's parents blessed the couple. And after the prayers, the evening passed in games and dancing with the bridegroom, but the bride with bridesmaids and friends were in another room. Now, I didn't read this anywhere, but perhaps the bridesmaids and the bride had a spa or something like that to enjoy the time together, but you won't find that in any of the documentation. Well, the next day was the wedding feast, a time of rejoicing, a village holiday, and a meal towards the end of the day was served separately to the men and women. The bride, dressed in white, surrounded by her bridesmaids, usually 10, sat under a canopy while songs and blessings were sung and recited. During this time, the groom arrived and the bride and groom came together. And with the couple together, everyone joined together. And under the canopy, which we would be familiar with, I'm sure, blessings are given to the couple. And the evening followed. Now, I'm sure when we talk about this parable together, there will be some symbols that we'll all agree on. We'll agree that the bridegroom is Jesus. We'll agree that the bride is his church, the group of believers. We'll agree, I think, that the wedding feast is Jesus' return to set up the kingdom, a time of rejoicing, a new beginning, a celebration of being united with our Lord. We'll agree, I think, that the 10 bridesmaids are 10 believers, that our lamp is our shining faith. We're the light of the world, and our light can't be hid under the dining room table. We're cities on a hill, shining a beacon to travellers in the night to help them reach their goal. We provide direction and light for others, or we should. The light of our lamp, how we live, should reflect Jesus' personal godliness and spirituality. But the sleeping, the marketplace, the oil, well, they're a little bit more tricky, aren't they? Now, some say that the bridesmaids are dead believers, but does that fit? The parable begins with then. It's actually connected to what has gone before. And we know what Jesus has been talking about before. That question we mentioned a few moments ago that runs through a couple of chapters there. And really the main focus of this whole passage is those who are alive at the time when Jesus returns to the earth. There's the signs of the times, of course. There's the reminder to know that if a thief is coming to your house, you better be up and ready and waiting for them, and not asleep in bed. The faithful and wise servant, and the servant who is not so faithful and wise, who says, my master's delaying his coming, and therefore it doesn't really matter what I do. All of this sets the scene for the parable of the 10 bridesmaids, who focuses on the wise, and the parable of the talents, focusing perhaps on the faithful. So I don't think this parable is a message for the world, because all 10 bridesmaids believe, all know that Jesus will come back. It's a message for living believers to be ready when Jesus returns. So connecting the 10 sleepers with dead believers doesn't work for me. Maybe those who promote that idea of being kind, because surely, perhaps they think, believers wouldn't sleep when their Lord is expected. We would never sleep, would we? But I ask you and myself, is that really true? Can we honestly say that we've never slept spiritually? And can we really say that we're not asleep now? And I'm not talking about nodding off a bit in the afternoon. We do sleep for many reasons, don't we? And as we think about some of these reasons, please look deep inside yourself, as I need to too. Sleepiness can spread through a community that tires of waiting for the bridegroom. There's so many false starts, perhaps. And this verse, assuredly I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place. It's been a challenge for us as a Christadelphian community, hasn't it? A generation, 40 years from the time Israel was declared a state. It had to be by 1988, so many were saying. And then when 1988 came and went, well, maybe it's Jerusalem in Jewish hands, so we've got till 2007. And then perhaps we redefined a generation and said, well, as long as somebody who was around in 1967 remains, there's still time for Jesus to come. But have we as a community become worried or tired of waiting when so many times we've thought it's happening? And we can fall asleep, of course, for another reason too, when everything else has filled our lives. When we're trying to keep all those balls in the air, as many of us do every day of our life, and the cares of this world take over and the stress mounts up. And we can also fall asleep because our service has become habitual and a little bit dull. Paul reminded us of these words for a reason. Let us not grow weary while doing good. It can get tough to keep going year after year after year. And life is difficult too if you're living in trouble. We have a lot to do with 3 refugees in Jakarta, and seeing their hopes raised and then dashed again hits us, let alone what it does to them. And we all have our challenges in life. And then in Gethsemane, we find that the disciples were sleeping for sorrow. They expected the kingdom would appear there and then, and were sad as they finally realised that this was not to be. Their beloved Lord was talking about betrayal and death and giving in to these evil leaders. And we need to watch our expectations too, because things don't always happen in life as we'd hoped they would. God doesn't always work to our schedule. Sometimes we can't understand why. And sometimes doubt overcomes us and disappointments attack and fears arise. Someone we respect walks away from the faith. And perhaps we ask a question, well, what if we're wrong? Our courage fails and our faith takes a battering. And then there's just weakness. We are human after all. And sometimes it's really hard to keep going. And finally, self-satisfaction can be a real problem in our society today. Pride and comfort and a lovely environment that many of us enjoy can be a problem for us too. So all of these things can cause us to become sleepy and to lose sight of what we are to be watching for. Now in the parable, everyone falls asleep, the wise and foolish. Is that saying that sleep is inevitable, that it's a fact of life? Or is Jesus simply pushing the sleep picture to shock us out of our lethargy and reminding us to be watchful? After all, it wasn't avoiding sleep that differentiated the wise from the foolish. The problem of the foolish was actually much more fundamental when we look at the words carefully. Jesus said, "Assuredly I say to you, I do not know you." And Jesus often said these words. "I never knew you, depart from me, you who practice lawlessness," we find in Matthew 7. And on the other hand, the positive reminder, "I'm the good shepherd, and I know my sheep, and am known by my own." That idea of knowing Jesus. These people, these 5 foolish virgins who came to Jesus, may have done many things in their life, but they had not built a real and authentic relationship with the bridegroom, and that left them unprepared. Who do you see when you look in the mirror each day? Jesus wants to see himself reflected in some small way in us. But what do we see? And what does he see when he looks at us? The other difference between the wise and the foolish was spare oil for their lamps. All of them felt that they were not ready. All were worried about their oil. All felt panic. The foolish felt panic because they had no spare oil. They knew they didn't have enough. They turned to their friends. Perhaps the wise had helped them before. But it was different this time, and they couldn't actually help them. As Psalm 49 says, none of them can by any means redeem his brother nor give to God a ransom for him. And what about the wise? They felt panic too because they feared running out of oil. And perhaps they felt some guilt for not being able to help their fellow believers, but they didn't want to share their oil. Why did the wise send the foolish to the market? It seemed to be poor advice, but a very human response, I think. They wanted to help, but didn't know how. What motivated this panic, so typical of humans? Now, I'm going to put some feelings that perhaps these wise and foolish virgins felt up on the screen. And I want you to think about who felt them. But I also want you to think about whether those feelings are positive or negative feelings, because we really need to think about ourselves in this situation, not about the 5 wise and the 5 foolish. What about extreme fear? What about loving respect? What about honest self-awareness, because God prefers humility to arrogance and pride? What about the thought that, well, I'm not quite ready, and neglected opportunities and personal unworthiness rush into their head and ours sometimes? Please, God, just a little bit more time, another opportunity. Or this one, I want to be the best I can for my Lord. Think about those feelings and how you feel, or might feel if you were in a similar situation. The key thing is are we ready? Are our lamps lit and working well? Do we have a supply of oil, or are we running on empty, just hanging in there so that a tiny blip in our world tips us over the edge? Are you a minimalist? Some of us get very good in this world at just doing enough to get by. But is this the way we want to run our spiritual life? In this moment of shock, it will be the real intent of our hearts that will determine what happens. Harry Whittaker called it our essential character. So do we feel ready? Are we confident in God's love and grace? Or do we doubt it a little, as so many characters in the Bible did at various times? Are we confident that we want to be with Jesus in the kingdom? Because there is a decision to be made, and we are the ones that control that decision. We can decide whether we want to be there or not. It's interesting, isn't it, that when the time for the flood arrived, Noah was invited by God to come into the ark. Perhaps that one's not so clear, but certainly with Lot's wife, the angels, with all of their power, couldn't save her against her will. They tried desperately to rescue her, but she would not be rescued. Do Jesus' words in Luke 12, to open up immediately, suggest that some won't be sure whether to open the door when Jesus fronts? God will not drag us kicking and screaming into the kingdom against our will. Our response shows whether we really want to be there or not. Are you sure that you want to be there? But off the foolish went to the supermarket and brought oil. Is this real? For me, it's really just part of the parable story and not teaching us that there'll be a time after Jesus calls us before the door of the kingdom is shut. I think we have to be careful not to push the story too far, because as we said, when they turned up at the door, Jesus didn't say they were too late. He said he didn't know them. The key message is that the oil to feed our lamp must be ours. We can't run an extension cord from our friend. It's not our family or our ecclesia or our group of friends or our Christadelphian community that ensures our place in God's kingdom. There are things we must do alone, things no one else can do for us. Our preparation for the kingdom is individual. So what is the oil? I think we've skirted around that debated issue a few times. It's perhaps the most difficult, but it's also the one that seems to us to be key. But what is the oil? And I'm going to put up some ideas now that if you do a bit of reading on this subject, you'll find there's a multitude of different ideas as to what people say the oil is. There is no agreement. There is no agreement amongst general Bible scholars, and there's no agreement within our community either. Just read some of the things that have been written about the oil. Let's talk about oil for a moment, because oil in the Old Testament really had three major purposes. It was used for food preparation, it was used for giving light, it was used for anointing and healing. And some people have created beautiful thoughts around number 3 there, based on anointing in the Old Testament. And yes, as children of God, we are symbolically anointed, empowered, strengthened by him to do his will. But the oil for the lamps is more connected here with number 2, isn't it? The simple olive oil for light. And I've come to the conclusion that we should not overanalyze the oil. I think the oil is different for different people. I think the oil is different at different times in my life. Oil is really an enabler in this story. What drives you to shine? What is it that keeps you shining, ready, alert and on task? And I think if we go through those list of things that people have said this is what the oil is, I think I can see that at times in my life, every single one of those things has been something that I need to focus on. Jesus often coupled watching with prayer. God's presence with us, our connection to him, the strength he promises us via multiple means, are all things that need to feed our lamps to keep them burning. A prayerful attitude guards us from temptation as we struggle with spiritual sleepiness. It can be what charges the batteries for our shining torch that keeps us ready for the wedding feast. I do love this saying, only the continual presence of God in our lives can keep the fire burning through the dark nights. What do you need today? What do you need to do in your life to fuel your lamp and to keep it bright? Let's return to the reason for the parable. The final message is very clear. Watch therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour in which the Son of Man is coming. It's a massive question, isn't it? What does God want us to watch for? We need to be very careful of this word watch, because we in our society today, mainly watch passively. We watch TV. Some of us do it with the sole purpose of sleeping and snoozing. We watch sport. We watch movies. You're sitting there watching me talk. But it's not this kind of watching that Jesus is talking about when he uses the word watching. We're not interested observers when we watch. We're not looking for intellectual stimulation. It's not just about watching world events, the signs of the times, for their sake alone. It's essentially far more than that. It's watching our behaviour, watching our character development, watching our relationship with God, watching how we use our time, our readiness for our Lord's return. There's two particular words for those of you who like the Greek that are translated watch in this section of Matthew. Different words for watching Jesus at the tomb and as he went up to heaven. So the words that we would normally associate with watching in English are not the words Jesus used here. Both these words are intensely active words. And every time these two words are used in the Bible, they mean a special kind of watching. So the first one there expresses not mere wakefulness, but the watchfulness of those who are intent upon a thing. To be sleepless, keep awake, watch, to be circumspect, attentive, ready, vigilant, alert. The second one, perhaps even stronger, spiritual alertness, vigilance. Be vigilant, be alert, be awake. So when we think about watch, we need to think that it's not the normal English use of the word watch. Now in Luke, Jesus talked about a faithful and evil servant with similar ideas, some of the similar ideas to the ones we've looked at already around the Olivet prophecy. But you'll see what it starts with. Let your waist be girded and your lamps burning. It's an active watching, the kind of watching of being ready and doing something. And whilst we're not going to look at any of these words, some of you may be able to see some of the ones marked in red, but you'll see that these words in the Bible are actually translated in different ways to watch sometimes, and they're interesting because it talks about sleeplessness and the word vigilant. So again, it illustrates the strength of this watching. But let's go together now to the Garden of Gethsemane, because this is the other time when Jesus presents a very strong message about watching. As they arrived at Gethsemane, Jesus said to the three, "Stay here and watch." Now, what did he mean? What did he want them to watch for? Did Jesus want them to make sure he was not disturbed? Did Jesus want to be warned as the soldiers approached? Well, no. We find out later he was not surprised at all by the arrival of Judas and the great company at all. He was standing ready, waiting for them, and he'd woken up the disciples too. He'd said, "Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand," and that happened before they came. There was much more to it. 3 times Jesus returned and found them sleeping. "Simon," he said to Peter, "are you asleep? Couldn't you keep watch for 1 hour?" Not once, not twice, but 3 times Jesus said these words. What did Jesus want from these disciples, his closest friends? Well, really what he wanted was positive support. It would have been so much easier for Jesus if these disciples were supportive and encouraging and sensitive to his need, compassionate, praying with him at this momentous time for him. And we all know that loyal and supportive friends can make a huge difference to our feelings, to our behaviour. It's such a pity, isn't it, that in his hour of need, Jesus didn't have beside him a Jonathan who came to David at perhaps the lowest point in his life when David seemed ready to throw it all in. And I just love the words that are used here when it says that Jonathan strengthened David's heart, his hand in God. And perhaps it's sad too that Jesus didn't have with him those nameless servants of Naaman the Syrian, who when Naaman thought it beneath himself to wash in the Jordan as Elijah had asked, by careful words, by concern and logic, these servants encouraged Naaman to do the right thing and he was healed. It was so sad that no one was there and available for Jesus. They were there physically, but they were not really there. And sometimes we, like those disciples in the garden, are not there for one another. We're not offering friendship, the right friendship for each other when we're needed most. Those words which express Jesus' heart, I think, at this time. In Psalm 69, reproach has broken my heart, and I am full of heaviness. I looked for someone to take pity, but there was none, and for comforters, but I found none. Jesus was not looking for definitive answers. He understood far more of what was going on than they, but he wanted friends sympathetic to his needs to sit, to pray with him. And Jesus' unanswered question was followed by another incredible statement: watch and pray lest you enter into temptation. And it does show that Jesus had much more in his mind than his own needs for support and companionship on this momentous night. And I'm sure it strikes you as it does me, is that while Jesus dealt with such significant issues, personal issues in Gethsemane, he's still working with his disciples. Yes, Jesus was saying something here that was far deeper, far more far-reaching than simply watching out for who was coming around the corner into the garden. I think Jesus was saying these words for himself, of course, because he used this time in Gethsemane to prepare for his trial and crucifixion. The time of his departure was at hand. He was at the pointy end of his time of opportunity, the time when it would be too late. And if we look at all of the words in the New Testament that talk about the difficulty of Jesus' decision to be crucified, they are found in Gethsemane. Jesus used this time to prepare for what was going to take place the next day. So during his trial and during his crucifixion, his mind was absolutely set. That happened in Gethsemane. And he knew the disciples were going to face an enormously difficult task over the next 3 days to cope with what had happened. This time of testing for them was really going to be extraordinarily difficult. He knew that, and he knew that they could prepare better than they did. But he knew too there was a lot of long-term work for them to do, and that only by watching and praying would they be able to continue the work that he knew he was going to leave them to do. And what about us too? because he's asked us to continue that work in our day and in our generation. And that message to watch and pray rings down to us today. And there's such an enormous contrast, isn't there in Gethsemane, between Jesus' approach and the disciples' approach. The disciples' mindset was that they were sleeping from sorrow, and there was an enormous amount of baggage with them there that night. Some of them wanted to fight for their Lord. All were suffering shades of unbelief. Some were guilty. Others were confused and troubled. They were exhausted from the bruising schedule of the final days of Jesus' work. And there were further cracks, of course, in their sometimes competitive relationships. The enormous emotion of the Last Supper had taken its toll. And in the garden, their approach was to try and sleep. What do you think? Do you think they had a good sleep? When Jesus said, "Wake up," did they rise refreshed and on top of things? And often our solution to the troubles and trials of life, those times when we face really difficult decisions, our solution is to try and get some rest. And we go to bed some nights only to lie and toss and turn and keep waking, our mind racing, and we get up the next morning stale and washed out and still tired. What does rest really mean? It doesn't mean a good night's sleep. When Jesus spoke of finding rest for our soul, it wasn't physical rest, but our mental state, our spiritual comfort. And Jesus chose a different way to the disciples. Was he physically exhausted? Absolutely. But he knew sleeping would not help him survive the next day. And Jesus in Gethsemane, on this biggest night of his life, showed the disciples and us that the way to counteract life's difficulties is to watch and pray. Jesus showed them and us that being alert is critical. It was physically true for him on this critical night. It was also spiritually true for this night and for every night. We must not sleep if there's unfinished business between us and God. Perhaps we might say, well, Gethsemane was fundamentally important, so significant in world history. And yes, it was. It was fundamentally important to Jesus and fundamentally important to the Father. But is that the issue, really, from a personal perspective? The issue was whether he would give in to his own will or do the Father's will. Whether the two of them on that next day would go together or apart. And it's often the issue for us when we face temptation or challenge, those difficult circumstances of our life. Will we go together with the Father and Jesus, or will we take our own path with all of the pain and challenge mentally that will likely bring to us? So let's take this intensely important spiritual wake-up call from Jesus in Gethsemane. So tonight, as we lie down to sleep, we can spare a thought perhaps about whether we are awake or asleep. Are we watching actively and vigilantly, or drifting through life, disengaged and unconnected? We need to watch and understand the dangers that are surrounding us, the things that will particularly make our life in Christ hard. We're all different, and we have to find out what it is. What are those buttons for us that we need to stop people pushing? we need to watch out for one another, because the strength and support we can provide for each other is so intensely important in our life. We need to watch our priorities and what we're sacrificing real sleep for. Watching ourselves, our heart, our behaviour. There may be persecutions and challenges coming as a result of our faith. Certainly that's what the Olivet prophecy talks about. We must watch for temptation to strike. Watch and pray lest we enter into temptation. We must watch and pray for the kingdom. We don't know how little time we have left, but we need to be ready. And above all else, we should watch Jesus and learn from his example. Remember that word, watch. It's an active word. We mentioned this phrase from Luke 12 already, where Jesus also talks about the idea of watching. And I do like what the NIV says for Luke 12, verse 35, be dressed, ready for service. Keep your lamps burning like servants waiting for their master to return from a wedding banquet. It's a strong message there, isn't it? It sounds a bit more real, I think, than let your waist be girded, which perhaps those words don't hit us quite as strongly. But think too about that other phrase in the middle of the Olivet prophecy too, when these things begin to happen, and we know those things are happening all around us every day, we're bombarded with it in our news. When these things begin to happen, look up and lift up your heads, because your redemption draws not near. And what are we looking at? What are we watching day to day? Are we watching down at all of the things happening around us in our life, or are we watching upwards to our God, to Jesus and what he needs us to do in our life? What a truly powerful message of good watching. And finally, I'd like to pick up these words that Paul wrote. I think he wrote these words with this idea of watching actively from his Lord. A look at all of the connections that we find in this passage with what we've talked about today. You're all sons of light and sons of the day. We are not of the night nor of darkness. Let us not sleep as others do, but let us watch and be sober. For those who sleep, sleep at night. Those who get drunk are drunk at night. But let us who are of the day be sober, putting on the breastplate of faith and love, and as a helmet, the hope of salvation. The picture there of being ready as a soldier for Christ that Paul used elsewhere, isn't that what having our waists girded is about as we watch? For God did not appoint us to wrath, but to obtain salvation. This is the offer that Jesus has provided to us through our Lord Jesus Christ, who died for us. That whether we wake or sleep, now I think he's talking about whether we are dead or alive at his coming, we should live together with him. So in coming days, let's think about this juxtaposition of Jesus and ask ourselves that question. Am I awake or asleep? Am I watching and praying every moment of every day?